In Languedoc, modern-day southern France, near the town of Albi, an ancient sect took on a new incarnation in the 12th century. Catharism, also called Albigensianism, after the city of Albi, was a belief system with history going back to the early Christian centuries. Cathars were dualists, believing in the existence of two gods. The god of spirit was good and locked in a cosmic war with the god of matter. For the Cathars, only spirit was good, while all material reality was evil. The goal of the Cathars was to free themselves from the prison of the physical body and enter into the pure realm of spirit. This could only be achieved by the ritual of consolamentum, administered by a Cathar perfect, one who had already attained purity. Once cleansed by the consolamentum, a perfect had to remain sinless. Perfects practiced extreme austerity, reducing body mass by rigorous fasting. Sexual activity was forbidden, since the evil god used sex to trap souls in bodies. Eggs and meat, the products of sexual union, were forbidden as food. The vast majority of Cathars were not perfects, but lay believers who had not yet received the consolamentum. Believers were encouraged to avoid meat and sex. At the hour of death, the believer would be perfected by the consolamentum. We can see the great divergence between the teachings of the medieval church and Catharism. Catholic belief holds that despite sin, God's material creation is inherently good. Procreation is a good, and man can serve God by the virtuous use of physical matter. More crucially, for the Cathars, Christ is spirit only, and the notion that he became man is blasphemy. The idea that Christ would effect salvation through a physical sacrifice on the cross was abhorrent to Cathar sensibilities. The perfects preached that the institutional church was the great evil of the world. The Pope and the bishops were agents of the wicked god of matter. The resurrection of the body was a lie. Marriage was vile, since it bound physical bodies together to condemn more souls to slavery via the sexual act. What was it that made Languedoc particularly fertile ground for Catharism? Throughout Christendom, the secular powers regarded heresy as treason and forbade it. But unique developments in Languedoc rendered secular authority highly fractious. The most powerful lord in the area was the Count of Toulouse, who in theory held lands from the kings of France, England, and Aragon, as well as the German emperor. In reality, his own territories were often beyond his control, and regional barons acted with virtual independence. A notable feature among the nobles of Languedoc was the idea of the free right to one's territorial inheritance, with no feudal responsibilities. Compared to the situation in England, Spain, and northern France, vassalage was weak. This encouraged private warfare and feuding among the nobility, often accompanied by a failure of public law and order. In such conditions, the suppression of heresy was either of little concern or impossible. Although Cathars hailed from all social classes, their numbers were strong among the nobility. Despite the political instability, southern France was lavishly wealthy. The fiercely independent lords held extravagant courts filled with exotic musicians, travelers, and thinkers of every kind. Indeed, Languedoc, the land of wine and song, was known for a voluptuousness that's directly contradictory to Catharism. And yet, amid these glamorous courts, the austere Cathar perfect tended to stand out and attract fascination. Albigensian dualism was new and seemed a path to some secret elitist knowledge. The ferocity with which the Cathars preached against the prevalent extravagance made them all the more compelling. It's not uncommon for aestheticism to take hold in times of plenty. Historian Christopher Tyerman cautions us from assuming that Languedoc had become a Cathar province. By the dawn of the 13th century, there were around 1,000 to 1,500 perfects operating in the area. The number of believers is impossible to know. Traditional church structures continued, and Orthodox Christianity prevailed among the masses. More important than the raw numbers of the Cathars were the inroads they'd made among the social elite. The situation is illustrated by a statement made in 1206 or 1207 by one Pons Adamar, a typical knight and small landholder of the region. When asked by Bishop Fulk of Toulouse why he refused to expel heretics from his lands, Pons replied, "We cannot. We were brought up with them. There are many of our relatives among them, and we can see that their way of life is a virtuous one. By the dawn of the 13th century, the growth of Catharism in Languedoc was producing considerable alarm among church authorities. Historian Thomas Madden provides an explanation as to why. In the medieval world, heresy did not represent benign religious diversity. Far from it. It was seen as an insidious and cancerous threat to the well-being of Christendom and the salvation of the faithful. Christ's admonition to St. Peter still bound his successor, "Feed my sheep." As shepherds of Christ's flock, the Pope and bishops kept a sharp eye out for those who would lead the members astray. Innocent III, who became Pope in 1198, immediately took steps to combat Catharism. He sent legates to southern France with broad powers to reform the church, preach the gospel, and debate with local perfects. However, Innocent's agents met with little cooperation. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse did not seem eager to take action. Raymond VI may well have despised Pope Innocent's attempts to influence affairs in his domains, but the question still remains. Given the political circumstances of Languedoc already discussed, could he have even effected the change the Pope desired? Innocent's attempt at reform engendered bitter resentment among the elite of Languedoc, who valued their independence and resented outside interference. His patience at an end, the Pope excommunicated Count Raymond in 1207. In 1208, Raymond tried to secure absolution. He met with the Pope's legate, Peter of Castelnau, but their discussion was less than cordial. Raymond became so irate that he threw Peter out, warning that he would be watching him wherever he went. The following morning, on January 14, the papal legate was assassinated near Arles. The killer was never found. These developments enraged Pope Innocent, who held Count Raymond responsible. Raymond denied any knowledge or involvement in the murder, but historian Janet Shirley is confident enough to describe the murderer as one of Raymond's men. In the aftermath of the murder, Peter of Castelnau failed to garner the popular image of a martyr, and even Pope Innocent admitted to the absence of the customary miracles that generally accompanied martyrdom. But the killing of a papal legate would have serious consequences nonetheless. For Innocent, it was time to move on to more drastic measures. He determined that the solution to the Cathar problem was a crusade. In our next episode, we'll investigate the first phase of the Albigensian Crusades.
What is this we are within? Yellow leaves are on the yard, and we walk together every day.
Following the assassination of his papal legate in the Languedoc, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Cathar heresy and the ruler that he felt was protecting it, Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse. The Pope appointed Arnaud Aimery, Abbot of Citeaux, as chief papal legate in charge of recruitment. He abolished usury and delayed the repayments of debts, which by now was the traditional mechanism for allowing crusaders to raise funds for their participation. Plus, the French church was taxed to finance the army. It was just over a century since Pope Urban II had preached the First Crusade. By now, crusading was an institution in the West, and Pope Innocent was doing much to standardize the process by which holy war was preached, financed, and organized. Before, crusading had been prosecuted exclusively on the frontiers of Christendom against external enemies, Saracens in the Holy Land in Spain, and pagans in the Baltic. But Innocent's Albigensian War was a new thing entirely, an internal crusade, launched against the rulers of Languedoc, a region within Latin Christendom. Bold idealism, directed outward against an external problem, is easily turned inward in the quest for righteousness. Recently, crusading had suffered some reverses in its main theaters against the Saracens. Jerusalem had been lost in 1187, while in Spain in 1195, the Kingdom of Castile had suffered a great defeat at the Battle of Alarcos. If the body of Christendom itself was weakened by an internal sickness, then how could it be healthy to stand in battle against the external foe? Pope Innocent was convinced that Catharism must be rooted out at home if the crusade on the frontier was to be successful. Across northern France, thousands of men responded fervently to Arnaud Aimery's recruitment. In spring 1209, a large army assembled to wage the crusade. This alarmed Count Raymond VI of Toulouse. On June 18, 1209, Count Raymond appeared on the steps of the Abbey of St. Gilles before the great western facade depicting Christ's passion and death. There, the Count openly confessed to all the Pope's charges against him, including supporting heretics. He then entered the Abbey church, stripped off his shirt, and submitted to a penitential whipping by a papal legate. Now reconciled with God, Count Raymond himself donned the Pilgrim's Cross and rode out to join Arnaud Aimery's army. By joining the crusade, the Count ensured that his own lands would be safe from attack. As the Crusade's first target, Arnaud Aimery selected a region heavily populated with Cathars, the domain of Raymond Roger of Trencavel, Viscount of Béziers and Carcassonne. Raymond Roger refused to join the crusade, opting instead to resist, for he trusted in the fortifications of his cities. The Crusaders laid siege to Béziers, while Raymond Roger rode for Carcassonne to organize its defense. Within Béziers, the citizens prepared to defend their city, which contained probably around 700 Cathars out of a population of roughly 8,500. The Bishop of Béziers tried to convince the citizens to hand over the city's heretics, but they refused. The people of Béziers saw the siege in political, not religious terms. This was a threat to their independence, and they intended to resist. Rather than hide behind their walls, the men of Béziers launched a sortie against the enemy camp. When they were beaten back and forced to retreat, some of the Crusader infantry managed to penetrate the city. Béziers fell, and as the city was put to sack, a massacre ensued that horrified all of Christendom. Chroniclers from the Crusader camp laid the blame for the massacre on the poor and the army, insisting that the commanders hadn't ordered it. It's also possible that Arnaud Aimery was trying to make an example out of Béziers for harboring heretics. The infamous quote often attributed to the abbot of Cîteaux of "kill them all, God will know his own," is likely a later invention, but it certainly highlights the merciless brutality that took place at Béziers. The traditional ideal of the Crusades to defend Christians against violence had suddenly been perverted to inflict violence on Christians themselves. Christopher Tyerman writes that Béziers set the tone for what developed into one of the nastiest of medieval wars, partly because of the high stakes of dispossession and conquest, partly because of the collapse of social order and the erosion of the rule of civil law in a region that became a perpetual war zone. Stunned by events at Béziers, Raymond Roger prepared to make his stand at Carcassonne. On August 15, he offered to surrender, and the Crusaders accepted, allowing the citizens of Carcassonne to depart peacefully. Raymond Roger was thrown into his own dungeon, where he died a few months later. Arnaud Aimery now needed someone to rule the Trencavel lands and set up a base for future operations. He selected a nobleman in his late 40s called Simon of Montfort, a bull of a man with an imposing physique and a lustrous mane of hair. Simon had a certain reputation for righteousness because 7 years earlier, he had abandoned the renegade Fourth Crusade when it diverted from its intended target of Egypt in favor of attacking the Christian city of Zara. Meanwhile, Count Raymond VI returned to Toulouse. His dealings with the Pope's representatives broke down once more. He believed that the papal legates were making deliberately impossible demands of him, while they were convinced that he still had no intentions of purging his lands of heresy. Thus, Simon of Montfort prepared to resume the crusade against Toulouse. Throughout 1211 and 1212, Simon tried to encircle Toulouse itself by conquering all the surrounding forts, but he began running into a serious problem. Pope Innocent had set the minimal duration of service in the war at 40 days. This encouraged recruitment, since a man could gain the spiritual benefits and prestige of crusading and still be back home in 40 days' time. During the spring and summer, Simon had a large crusader army at his disposal with which to subdue castles in the Languedoc. But once autumn arrived, the majority of crusaders returned home, and the locals could easily throw off Simon's rule and resume their allegiance to Count Raymond. In 1213, Simon ran into an even bigger problem. Pope Innocent suspended the crusade indulgence in the Languedoc. The Pope was planning a new crusade to the Holy Land, and he didn't want potential recruits opting instead for the Cathar Wars. Simon suddenly found himself left entirely to his own devices. To make matters worse, he was about to face yet another obstacle: For years now, Raymond of Toulouse had been sending pleas for assistance to his overlord in the Iberian Peninsula, King Pedro II of Aragon. Pedro now intended to march north and bring aid to Count Raymond against the Lord of Montfort. This introduced yet another complicating factor, for Pedro II, alongside the other rulers of Spain, had just achieved one of the great crusading victories of the era, the defeat of the Almohads at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212. How then was Simon of Montfort, supposedly fighting for God, to stand in defiance against a man who embodied the very ideals of the Crusades movement? In the next episode, we'll investigate this clash between Pedro and Simon, which proved to be one of the defining moments of the Albigensian Crusade. In late 1212, King Pedro II of Aragon contacted Pope Innocent III on behalf of his vassals in the Languedoc. The King of Aragon argued that Simon of Montfort's crusade had gotten out of hand and that by threatening Toulouse, Simon was persecuting loyal Catholics rather than heretics. Pope Innocent found Pedro's arguments convincing. In January 1213, the Pope wrote to Simon, accusing him of misusing the crusade and committing atrocities against Christians. The Pope also wrote to his legates in the Languedoc, explaining that he considered the mission of the Albigensian Crusade to be successfully completed. Foxes were destroying the vineyard of the Lord in Provence, wrote Pope Innocent, but they have now been captured. Therefore, the Pope effectively suspended the Albigensian Crusade. He ordered Simon and the papal legates to hear King Pedro's complaints and then report back to him. Pedro insisted that key lands in the Languedoc be returned to their proper lords. He also declared that Count Raymond VI would agree to defend the true faith in his territory, so long as it was returned to him from Simon. The King of Aragon himself agreed to act as guarantor for Count Raymond's compliance with papal policy. The papal legates outright rejected all of this, insisting that the Languedoc was still rife with heresy and that the local lords were protecting it. They would not surrender an inch of Simon's conquests. King Pedro and the papal legates now waged a legal battle, each side flooding the Pope's courts with letters appealing their case. But at this point, both sides grew impatient with the diplomatic process. In the summer of 1213, King Pedro assembled his army and crossed the Pyrenees into Languedoc, where he received assistance from Count Raymond and other local lords. Ultimately, Pedro fielded an army of around 2,000 cavalry and some 2,000 or 4,000 infantry. Numbers remained a problem for Simon of Montfort, who assembled in total perhaps 1,500 men, including 900 cavalry. The two forces met at the fortress of Muret on September 12. Simon ordered a concentrated attack straight into the enemy units. The audacity of Simon's attack worked, as his first contingents broke through Pedro's formations and penetrated straight toward the King of Aragon himself. Meanwhile, Simon attacked Pedro's flank with his reserve unit. Amid the bloody struggle, King Pedro was slain, which caused desertions throughout his forces. Simon emerged victorious, despite being greatly outnumbered. After Muret, resistance to Simon collapsed, and he conquered most of Raymond's lands. All he needed now was papal recognition of his rule. In November of 1215, Pope Innocent referred the matter to the Fourth Lateran Council. The council ruled that Raymond VI had been guilty of harboring heretics and granted Simon the right to rule over those portions of the Languedoc that he'd already conquered. Provence would be held in trust by the church for Count Raymond's son until he came of age. Despite this ruling, the nobles and towns of the Languedoc still fiercely resisted Simon, who imposed a stern rule upon his new lands. He forced the people of Toulouse to swear an oath of loyalty to him, then dismantled the city's walls. Meanwhile, Raymond VI and his son arrived in Provence. Raymond's son, the future Raymond VII, was not at all like his lukewarm father, but bold, decisive, and gifted as a commander. Raymond VII fired the independent spirit of the Languedoc, and soon the populace was rallying around him. On September 13, 1217, Raymond VI and a force of knights entered unfortified Toulouse. Immediately, the locals threw out Simon's representatives and declared for Raymond. The citizens of Toulouse, in a striking display of defiance, began to erect makeshift defenses for the city from earthworks and timber. Virtually every person in the town, young and old, man and woman, adult and child, set to work on the defenses, all the while singing traditional ballads of their region. Simon at once tried to retake the city, but many of his own troops were now defecting. The momentum had shifted decisively to the southern side. Toulouse was now the center of a final effort to expel the northerners. The new pope, Honorius III, sent letters demanding an end of the rebellion and recognition of Simon's rights. The southerners would have none of it. The siege dragged on through the winter of 1217. Finally, on June 25, 1218, Simon himself was struck on the head by a stone thrown from a mangonel. News of Simon's death spread joy throughout the Languedoc. The siege of Toulouse ended. This seemed to spell the end of the long, bitter invasion from the north. There was hope for a revival of the old order under Count Raymond VII of Toulouse. But the war wasn't yet over, for in the final chapter, the King of France himself would make his presence felt. In our next episode, we'll look at the conclusion of the Albigensian Crusade. The Battle of Muret represents a jarring moment in the history of the Crusades. Pope Innocent's decision to open up the Languedoc as a new theater of crusading meant that the Crusades were no longer exclusively waged against Christendom's external enemies, but now had been brought into the very heart of Christendom, in the region that is now southern France. The Crusade was intertwined with an internal political struggle within Christendom. The competition for influence in the Languedoc between the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of Aragon was an old one that predated the Albigensian Crusade. Pedro II and Simon both had political interests that they were trying to pursue. But we also can't forget the depth of obligation that traditional ties could inspire among the medieval nobility. For Pedro II, the Languedoc was a territory to which his forefathers had felt bound. Since the days of the First Crusade, noblemen from the Languedoc had often traveled to Aragon, where they provided important services to the king. The distress of the county of Toulouse prompted a reaction from Pedro II. Interestingly, Pedro's complaint to Innocent wasn't necessarily against the Crusade. It was that Simon had misused the Crusade. This reminds us of the keenly legalistic quality of the medieval era. Contrary to popular belief, the Middle Ages was not a period of unbridled brutish power, in which might and might alone decided issues. Medieval Latins were obsessed with legality. Long before Pedro and Simon ever met on the battlefield, they endlessly debated their disagreement in the papal court. And finally, let's not overlook that the Battle of Muret occurs arguably outside of the domain of crusading. Innocent had essentially suspended the Albigensian Crusade during the period when the battle took place. The Battle of Muret certainly represents a territorial struggle between Aragon and the northern French. Indeed, the Crusade itself, by the time we get to Muret, seems to have taken a back seat. In 1218, Simon of Montfort's son, Amaury, assumed leadership of the Albigensian Crusade, and Pope Honorius III restored the Crusade indulgence to the Languedoc. Honorius proclaimed that those who had not taken the cross for the Holy Land should take the cross for Languedoc, and even transferred a substantial portion of the funds raised for the Eastern Campaign to the Albigensian Crusade. But none of this could reverse the situation in the Languedoc, where the local aristocracy had clearly regained the advantage. By 1220, the Crusaders led by Amaury of Montfort held only a small patch of lands in the lower Languedoc, near Carcassonne, essentially the territory conquered in the first 2 years of the Crusade. In 1222, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse died, but his son, Count Raymond VII, who was more popular and gifted as a leader than his father, rallied the local nobility around himself. The situation was finally reversed by the direct intervention of the French monarchy. In January 1226, King Louis VIII of France took the cross and recruited a large army for his crusade. He marched on Languedoc with a force too substantial for the locals to resist. On September 9, Louis's army captured Avignon, nearly the whole of the county of Toulouse now declared for the King of France. Finally, the Albigensian Crusade came to an end with an agreement called the Peace of Paris, ratified on April 12, 1229. Raymond VII received the western and northern portions of his father's domain. Toulouse would be inherited by Raymond's daughter, Joan, who was to marry Alphonse of Poitou, son of King Louis VIII. The heirs of Alphonse and Joan would then inherit the region. Thus, at last, the old counts of Toulouse lost their territories to the French royal family. This was the clearest achievement of the Albigensian Crusade, the annexation of Languedoc by the Capetian dynasty. 1229 marked 20 years since the beginning of the Albigensian Crusade. 2 decades of fighting had annihilated the old ruling elite, but not Catharism, which still flourished throughout the Languedoc. However, with the region brought under the control of one of Europe's great monarchs, the Church could begin systematically uprooting the aberrant religion. A fund was established to support a center for the study and dissemination of theology in Toulouse, birthing the city's university. In 1233, the Inquisition was enacted in Toulouse. By 1250, Cathar leadership was oppressed and dwindling, and by the early 14th century, Catharism was dead in Languedoc. The history of the Inquisition in Languedoc is a topic for another time, but it's helpful to keep in mind that the Inquisition has been highly exaggerated and sensationalized, and its reality is far more mundane than the lurid tales produced by our popular culture. Also, by the dawn of the 14th century, Latin Christendom had finally lost the long crusade in the Holy Land, with Acre having fallen in 1291. Thus, a century after Pope Innocent III worried that Catharism's flourishing in the Languedoc would cause God to withdraw his favor from the Crusaders in the East, the crusade was won in France, but lost in the Holy Land. By the close of the 13th century, crusading seemed to have triumphed everywhere but in the Holy Land. The kings of Spain had crushed the Moors to their south, and the Teutonic Knights were victorious in the Baltic. But the Holy Land, where the Crusades movement took flame, had been lost to the Saracens. By the close of the 13th century, crusading had deeply shaped European civilization, transforming it into a Latin Christian powerhouse. From Spain to the Baltic, Languedoc to Paris, England to Italy, the Latin Church was triumphant, and the notion of the crusading Christian knight, for the time being, was unimpeachable. But what had been the cost of the Albigensian Crusade? The cost was 2 decades of brutal warfare that inflicted death and suffering on many lives. Atrocities were horrific on both sides. Indeed, the local nobility of the Languedoc were often willing to engage in shocking violence because they felt themselves backed into a corner, faced with losing everything if the Northerners triumphed. Meanwhile, men like Simon of Montfort proved equally capable of some of the era's greatest cruelties. One of our most interesting sources for the Albigensian Crusade is the Song of the Cathar Wars. This work was begun by William of Tudela, a supporter of the Crusade. William argued that Simon of Montfort was a hero, while the nobles of Languedoc were traitors upholding heresy. Halfway through the narrative, William stopped writing, and the document was taken up by an anonymous southern French writer who took the exact opposite perspective, that the crusade was false and the nobles of the Languedoc were heroically defending themselves. The anonymous author fiercely denies that Raymond of Toulouse and the other Languedoc nobles supported heresy and views the northern French as external aggressors. It's almost fitting that this primary source offers us these 2 conflicting perspectives on the Albigensian Crusade, which was the occasion for a bitter division within the heart of Christendom. Accepting the complexity of the Albigensian Crusade is part of beginning to understand it. For those of us living in the 21st century, we have to be careful not to let our prejudices color our evaluation of these events. We live in a time where we are quick to judge religious motivations as insincere. We look at Simon of Montfort and think, well, the whole crusade thing was just an excuse. He just wanted land and power. But we risk oversimplifying the medieval era if we go down this path. The truth is that in the Middle Ages, religious and political motivations were often, if not always, deeply intertwined. We can never truly know what's in another's heart, but it's perfectly feasible, even likely given the era, that Simon of Montfort was both a thoroughly sincere crusader and also hungry for land and power. It's also equally possible that Raymond of Toulouse was an entirely sincere opponent of heresy himself, who simply felt that he had to do what was necessary to defend his lands from an external aggressor. So in this way, the Albigensian Crusade was like almost any human conflict, with both sides convinced of their righteousness. To get at what's unique about the Albigensian Crusade, we need to look at its impact on the crusading movement in general. For Latin Christians, crusading in the Holy Land, Spain, and the Baltic represented the highest and purest of idealism. On these frontiers, they confronted God's enemies and battled for the greater good of Christendom. But the Albigensian Crusade involved crusading in the messy, internal political conflicts within their civilization. For despite the spiritual dimension of the Albigensian Crusade, it necessarily took up a territorial dispute between the northern and southern French. The popes, as the dispensers of the Crusade indulgence, were placed in the inevitable and perhaps unenviable position of granting righteousness to one side. By the middle of the 13th century, popes would be calling crusades against their own political enemies, such as the Holy Roman Emperor, and these crusades did not inspire the majority of Latin Christians with the same unanimous zeal as did the campaigns for Spain or Jerusalem. Such internal crusades, for some, represented papal abuse of the privilege of making a crusade. The Albigensian Crusade, in some respects, represents the beginning of this trend, in which one faction within Christendom, the nobility of the Languedoc, clearly believed the Pope was wrong in the way he directed the crusade. However, these more politically charged crusades didn't dampen the enthusiasm among Latin Christians for the more traditional type of crusade. The later crusades against the Ottomans and the final Spanish crusade in Granada would still inspire that high idealism that had colored Europe's response to the First Crusade back at the close of the 11th century.
I used to walk in woodlands every day. Since then the heat gets to me. Now I watch to it.
Support Real Crusades History on Patreon and get your questions about history answered directly by me, J. Stephen Roberts.